Yeah. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Center for American Progress Action Fund. Thank you for joining us this morning for our event. We will be getting started in just a couple of minutes. Two brief reminders before we begin. First, please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. Second, there will be a question and answer period following the panel discussion. We ask that you wait for the microphone to come to you. State your name and affiliation before your question. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Naveen Nayak. I'm the president and executive director of the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and I'm going to be the moderator today. Very excited to welcome you all to our first event of 2023, and couldn't think of a better conversation to start the year off than talking about young voters who are shaping the future of this country. So let me, I will introduce our panel, which is a fantastic panel to have this discussion with in a moment, but let me just say a few words to sort of set the topic for today. 3 months ago, all of the pundits, the media, conservatives were talking about not a red wave, but a red tsunami. They were talking about a shellacking. They were talking about progressives being in panic. None of that happened. From Arizona to Michigan, from Pennsylvania to Minnesota, progressives won up and down the ballot, races they were not expected to win, flipping state houses, state senates, and of course, winning a lot of statewide races. Obviously, success has a lot of fathers and mothers, but one thing that is undeniable is the role that young people played in the election. If you look at the Senate race in Pennsylvania, John Fetterman won young voters by a 70-29 margin. You look at the governor's race in Wisconsin, Governor Evers was reelected by a similar margin. And in Georgia, Raphael Warnock was reelected to the Senate by a 2-to-1 margin. No other age cohort supported one party by a larger margin. All those races were decided by less than 5 points. In each case, young people were difference makers. And this is not the first time. This was the second highest turnout for young people in a midterm. The highest turnout was in 2018, and the highest turnout ever was in 2020. So there is a pattern that has emerged in the last few elections of young people showing up, having their voices heard, and shaping the direction of this country. What does it mean for the future of where this country goes? What does it mean for future elections? We have a fantastic panel to dig into that. And so let me go ahead and introduce them. So I'll start on the far right. Our new representative, not elect anymore. Congressman Maxwell Alejandro Frost is one of the newest members of Congress, representing the 10th District of Florida, not only the youngest member, but the first from Gen Z to serve in Congress. Prior to that, National Organizing Director with March for Our Lives and organizer with ACLU. It's great to have you here. To his left, Cristina Tzintzún Ramirez, who is the President Executive Director of NextGen America, which is focused on empowering young people to engage in the political process. They've had unbelievable success, registering 1.4 million young voters and really leading the way in 2020 with more than 4.6, helping turn out more than 4.6 million young voters in, as I mentioned, the highest turnout election for young people in this country. She's also the founder of 2 statewide organizations in Texas on civil rights issues. Fantastic to have you, Cristina. And last, but certainly not least, Rachel Russell, who is the Associate Director of Polling and Analytics at the Hub. She oversees and manages all the day-to-day polling and research and analytics for the Navigator. For those of us in DC paying attention to politics, it's become an indispensable tool for understanding where the public is at and what's driving conversations. And before that, she was with the National Domestic Workers Alliance. So welcome to you all. I will just start with you, Congressman. Obviously, a very symbolic victory. First time a Gen Z is serving in Congress. I'd love to just start the conversation there. What does your election represent? What does it say about your generation's engagement in politics?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. Hello, everybody. Hope everyone's doing well. This is the thing I've been thinking a lot about, because this is, the 2 things people know about me is that I'm Gen Z and I couldn't get an apartment in DC. So I've been thinking a lot about this. And, I think a few things. Number one, being the first of anything in an institution like Congress, I think is worth celebrating and is exciting, right? But I think the point here is not that Gen Z's been waiting to get into Congress. We just got old enough. I'm the oldest a Gen Zer can be. But I think it's the fact that we've gotten in so early. And that we're being involved so early. And I attribute a lot of that to these huge movements we've seen over the past several years, things like March for Our Lives, things like after seeing a Black man being lynched in broad daylight on Twitter, George Floyd, taking to the streets, an entire generation really fighting for justice, and then taking that power and, yes, taking it to the ballot box, running for office, but also being involved in local mutual aid and being involved in arts and culture and everything like that. I have the unique perspective of being someone who has worked in electoral space. I'm also an artist, and then I've also done mutual aid, and now I'm a candidate. And so I think oftentimes we hear people dismiss one element of advocacy, but I think we need all of it. I mean, we need every tool in our toolbox. And so what does this mean? I think it's exciting. I think it's a message to Gen Z, but Gen Zers are I think young people are like pretty stubborn and are excited no matter what, right? If I was elected or not. But I think this is actually a bigger message to everybody else, to not count young people out of the process, not count young people out of anything. And I don't see myself as the representative of a generation. I see myself as the representative of Florida's 10th Congressional District. We're all representatives of Gen Z, right? Like all Gen Zers, whether you're, clergy, a teacher, an artist, etc. We're all tasked with that. And so, yeah, it's the honor of a lifetime.
Fantastic. We'll spend some time looking forward, obviously, and where we're going, but I want to take a few minutes to step back and talk, obviously, about the midterms we just came out of. Cristina and Rachel, I want to turn to you with a few questions, and I'll pull you in as well, Congressman. But just obviously a lot of conversation, and people are trying to figure out why we saw this sort of record turnout in 2018. One part of that really focused on the threats, which were pretty historic around abortion. A lot of survey research showed, or even analysis, I think by Circle, that was the top issue for young voters. Maybe I'll start with you, Cristina, just in terms of the threats on abortion, on democracy, how much did that play either in your conversations or in your sense of what led to this sort of historic turnout?
Well, I think what you said in the beginning was important, that it's 2018, it's 2020, it's 2022. So NextGen is coming up on our 10-year anniversary, and we were started with the premise that we could take on the biggest challenges around climate change, around income inequality, if we mobilized young people, which 10 years ago, we were told was a waste of money and time because young people would never turn out. And so this third election of historic turnout has busted the myth that one, young people don't care, and two, that also for myself, a grandma millennial, that as we're getting older, we're becoming more conservative, and the data is also busting that as well. So young people turned out in 2018, yes, and in 2020 to defeat the threat of fascism. But young people also turned out because they are trying to build a country that is more just, more inclusive, more fair. And so record-breaking youth voter turnout didn't just get us the defeat of Donald Trump. It got us historic gun safety legislation. It got us the largest and single investment by any single country on the planet to tackle the climate crisis. It got us student debt cancellation, and it got us long overdue marijuana reform. And that is just the beginning of the youth agenda. And so I think we see a lot of young people that were mobilized, especially young women, because of the threat on abortion rights and the clear understanding that this wasn't the end, but this was the opening salvo to take away our rights, the gains we had made on marriage equality, take away our rights to contraception. And so I think young people, the myth that I always tell you, older folks, and they say young people don't care, is this is the most progressive generation in American history right now. This is also the most politically engaged generation in American history. And so long term, young people are remaking what's possible politically and what's possible on policy in this country. So I get a lot of hope and excitement that this isn't just it's no longer just a coincidence. This is a pattern which we have to pay attention to and invest in.
Rachel, let me pull you on that same question, just how the threats from MAGA Republicans taking away sort of these freedoms played or more broadly in the
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was a huge thing at play for young voters, especially women under 30. But we had been tracking sort of risks to abortion as it sort of began at the state level. And in Texas, in September of 2021, sort of just getting a baseline of how Americans were feeling, how they thought, how they viewed the right to abortion at risk, and what they viewed about the Supreme Court, about their favorability. And we saw a complete 180, especially when it came to trust in the Supreme Court, their favorability and opposition to the Supreme Court's decision on Dobbs, given the leaked decision in May, and then further in June when the actual decision came down. There was we were seeing extreme opposition, especially from young voters, and that went as far as to the ballot. We saw in our post-election survey among 2022 voters, people that said they voted in the midterms this year, they're among young people and women under 30, what they said was the reason that brought them out as their main takeaway for voting for Democrats in this election was that they said that they wanted they believed that Democrats were going to keep the right to make the decision to have an abortion between a patient and their doctor, and not give that decision to the government. And so I definitely think the threats, on top of landmark legislation being passed, I think the threats to abortion access, especially among a generation that has grown up with that as a guarantee for 50 years. The millennials and Gen Z have expected this. And so to just take that away, especially starting at the state level and then further at the federal Supreme Court level, young people were not just going to stand by, and we definitely saw that in this election.
Great. I actually want to bring you in, Congressman, on the same point, but from a slightly different perspective, which is Cristina sort of touched on this. We did see one of the most productive Congresses in a generation, especially on issues that young people not only care about and support, but that they've been agitating for action on. largest investment ever in climate change, cancellation of up to $10,000 in student debt, first time doing anything about gun violence in this country in 30 years. I'm both curious how much in your own race this played a factor, and whether you think, you know, a lot of the media coverage, a lot of the communication did focus, understandably, on the threats that were very visceral as well. Is there more room, even moving forward, to be touting, sort of reminding people of what actually has gotten accomplished over the last couple of years?
Yeah, no, I think we have to, right? I mean, we're coming into a Congress where I'm like, yesterday was sitting down with my team, was looking at all the things I'm voting on this week. And, you know, I just got really sad. This is a Congress that's going to be passing a lot of resolution and bills to virtue signal, right? I mean, we have a Republican majority that wants to fight to take away the right to choose and the right to bodily autonomy. They want to fight to, at the expense of marginalized communities, bring up other communities. And so for me, it's important that we continue to get back to what the last 2 years have been. And we have to be honest, it wasn't everything we wanted. We know this, right? We understand this. But I think showing people that government can work for them is part of what's going to help with voter turnout. There's no big secret why 50% of this country doesn't vote, right? It's because people for generations have been lied to by politicians who say, vote for me and this will happen. That's just not how our system works. And I think it's important that we have leaders who don't see themselves as just working for movements or for people, but working with people and see themselves as part of a greater whole, right? And that's the way I see myself. A lot of that comes from the fact that I've been an organizer and come from the movement world. But that's the way I see myself. That's the way I see my colleagues. We're working in this institution to fight for a better world, to pass the bills we want. But we all know that to pass the bills you want, it's a math problem. And to fix that math problem, we got to get people to go out and vote a lot of these people out and switch it, right? You got to change the math. And so I think all of this comes down to showing people that government can work for them. And I think touting the wins of the last 2 years is an incredibly important part of that, especially because for these next 2 years, we're not going to see any bills like that get passed. I don't say this to be pessimistic. I say this to be realistic, because I think setting expectations is part of the reason we're in the problem we're in now with people not going out to vote, because the expectations have been here and people get this and they feel like my vote doesn't matter. And I don't blame them, and I'm not going to shame them for feeling that way. All we can do is point forward, look at what we've done, and talk about this broader movement, the fact that we need everybody at the table. We know voting isn't going to save us all. It's one tool in our toolbox, but we need to use it, right?
Excellent. Yeah, and if anyone had any doubts, last week probably put them to rest of whether this Congress would get anything done. I want to pull in another issue that wasn't really central to the midterms, but a lot of data has shown, and Cap's written about this, that young voters are the generation that supports unions at sort of the highest level. 2/3 of young voters support unions. Cristina, I know you have a background working on these kinds of issues. I'm curious to have you talk about both why you think that this generation has such a solidarity for unions and support for unions. And are there any other issues that we're not paying attention to where young voters really are going to be a force, either in shaping the economy or in shaping sort of, we talk about the ones like climate and obviously gun violence I'm curious if there are others like that might be under the radar more broadly.
Yeah, so my first job was I ran an organization organizing construction workers in Texas for about 10 years, and then worked both for United Auto Workers and SEIU, two some of the greatest unions in the country. This is the first generation in American history to be worse off than their parents. When we talk about core issues that young people are up against, and I also think about what's been centered in the Democratic Party, climate change, racial justice, economic justice, a lot of that has come from young people organizing in Occupy Wall Street, organizing in the climate movement. And the next big frontier is also about housing and inequality in this country. And I think we're going to see young people organizing around that issue more and more. But because it's the first generation to be worse off than their parents, young people are thinking about, why don't we judge our economy by how well working people are doing instead of just by the GDP and unemployment figures? That there has to be a reset in how we think about economic well-being in this country. And the climate crisis actually gives us the opportunity to rethink what we value. And right now, I think the number right before, I think it was 75% of Americans supported labor unions. Is that number correct? I think it was 75%. So it was a very like historic high. It's a very historic high, or maybe 75% of young people and 67% of the overall American public. It's very, very historic high. And so I think one of the things that I wish we had done more of this election, especially reaching out to young people, at NextGen, we divided up our electorate. We talked to young women, because young college-educated women said they cared about abortion when we polled them. And then more young, less college-educated young people wanted to talk about the economy. And I think that there was a lot of debate on our side about whether we talked about abortion or economy. And in my mind, it's not either or, it's both and. And that economic pain that people feel is real. And that if we're not talking about the economy, then the other side talks about the economy. And there's only one party in my mind that supports raising the minimum wage to a living wage. There's only one party that supports unions and protecting them. And there's only one party that supports taxing the rich their fair share. And so we need to do a better job of owning the economic future. And it is not just about making changes on the margins. I think it's about reshaping and rethinking our entire economy, and unions are going to be central to that. And that's why you have young people at the forefront of Starbucks and Amazon and these fights that are energizing young people across the country.
Excellent. I don't know if either of you want to chime in either on that issue, which I think is having a ton of energy right now across the country. Again, didn't play in the political electoral conversation, or if there are other issues that you think young people are really sort of pushing the envelope on that the broader public should be paying attention to.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we talk about this generation being so pro-union, I think a lot does have to do with this life-changing pandemic that we've seen. And, you know, people were deemed essential workers. And I think we're unfortunately seeing this big business mentality where employees aren't getting the respect that they deserve from their employers, and they're seeing that shareholders are making record profits, and unfortunately wages aren't staying with inflation. And so I think this generation fairly sees this lack of transparency, this lack of fair wages, and really has hopefully become advocates in this space for good, because I think it's something that unfortunately the pandemic has really exacerbated.
I'll say another part of it, I think too, and I think this connects to all the issues, is that I've found in my organizing that young people really see the world through the eyes of the most vulnerable, right? And they're using that vision to inform the way they feel about all these issues. That's why so many young people are so pro-union, right? It's about thinking about our most vulnerable communities, our workers, the communities we live in, our parents, our friends, us, right? We're thinking about our community. Same thing with immigration, foreign policy, gun violence. When you know, every time I get into youth organizing spaces, or I'm hearing people talk about these issues, I think when we talk about this generation being the most progressive generation we've seen, I think a lot of it has to do with just having this, you know, approach where humanity is at the forefront of everything. You know, the first thing we think of is a human, a person, love. And I think that informs, you know, every single one of the issues.
That's excellent. I want to obviously not treat young voters, as a few of you've touched on, as monolithic. So we saw pretty significant differences with young women supporting Democrats at a much higher rate than young men. We saw support among young Black voters hovering around 90%. Young white voters in the sort of 50s or 60s, and then obviously a continued sort of real difference between those who went to college or. So I'm curious how you all think, Cristina, you touched a little bit about this in terms of the messaging approach for different audiences, but just to reflect on how we should be thinking about that more broadly, in not assuming that there's one issue or one message that's going to kind of click with all young voters, and maybe go across.
Absolutely. I think Cristina was completely correct in that young women were in our polling specifically showed that abortion was their number one issue when they left the polls. We also saw that Gen Z said a similar thing, but across gender and race, we were also seeing inflation as a really big pain point. And this was really across generations, with Gen Z feeling it a little bit less, but this is something that I think we all feel when we go to the grocery store, and it's not something to ignore. I think revisioning an economy that is going to work for everybody is really important for the progressive space, so that, you know, maybe we're thinking about paid paid family and medical leave, just revisioning a world that not only includes, abortion rights and making sure that we're thinking about, what young women are thinking about, but the larger picture of how we make this economy more just for all. So I would say that really making sure that we are thinking about listening to all voters, all young voters. And this also starts with, I think, something we're thinking about in the polling industry of how we reach young voters. Does anyone on the stage have a landline? No, we don't poll young people that way anymore. We do a lot of web-based panels. We do multimodal and qualitative groups so that we are really trying to listen and understand how young people feel and what they're thinking about, so that we're not just, getting the few old white people with landlines.
Other thoughts?
So, there was clear differences on gender. At NextGen, we classify young voters as 18 to 35. And that's a huge cohort. What a 19-year-old needs that a 32-year-old needs is very different at their stage of life. Also, I think we think of young voter, and the first image that usually comes to many people's minds is a young person, a young white person, usually on a college campus. And that is actually not the majority of who we're talking to. We need to remember this is the most diverse generation in American history. This is also the most queer generation. There was a huge divide in young voters that were LGBTQ. It was the biggest distinction of how many voted for progressives. And also, when we think about the backbone of the Democratic Party, oftentimes people think of a young African-American or a young Latina woman. Well, the most common age for a Latina and African-American woman to have their first child is age 25. So we are also talking about a lot of young working class families and working families, and need to make sure our messaging reach and speaks to that. And so that's why we segment our messaging and our outreach based on, we look at not just gender, we look at race, obviously, but we also look at stage of life. Do they have children? Do they not have children? Are they college educated or not college educated? And it isn't to say that that changes. What it changes is what their pain points are, and that we have to speak to people's pain so that they can understand their power that they have to make progressive change.
Yeah, the quick thing I'll say on this is I think one of the biggest problems with our party is this notion that there's one like silver bullet or one message, right, that'll get young people, that'll get women, or that'll get whoever. And I really do think the age of the single issue voter is really dying, especially young folks coming in. What I find is young people are viewing a lot of these issues holistically, right? So when I talk with people and I say, what issues do you care about? Either I'm on a college campus or I'm an event or this and that. I never hear one event. I'm always hearing a million events and how or a million problems and how they kind of tie together. And I think it's really important that our messaging also reflect the same thing. And that's something we did in my campaign. And a lot of our organizing, and I agree, it is on college campuses, but also was outside of it. Our youth organizing program most of it was outside of college campuses and more around culture-based and art-based events, because that's where we were able to get an electorate that needed to be spoken with. A lot of these colleges, especially like UCF and Orlando, they have a lot of programs through student government and this and that to get young people involved. It's not enough, but it's great. But we were really focused on our community college, number one, because those students live in the community year round and they're from there. And then we get to reach their parents as well. But the other thing is, how are we communicating with folks who are outside of college and who are not doing that route in their life? And so I think it's important that we meet people where they're at.
That's excellent. I will open it up in a couple of minutes. I just have a couple more questions for the group, so just get your questions ready. But one was, you touched on this a little bit, Congressman. We are heading into a period where, at least in DC, very little is going to get done. I think when a younger generation that recognizes the threats we face, whether on climate or gun violence, where we're going to get reminded of these, sadly, regularly through storms or sort of horrific acts of violence, there's a real sense of impatience. I'm curious how, both from maybe Cristina, from a NextGen perspective, communicating on this, and, obviously as a congressman, how do we go about keeping this generation engaged in the next 2 years when there is this frustration with what's going to happen, at least in Washington, and how to communicate to make sure they don't sort of disengage, because government isn't going to be doing much?
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a fight. There's going to be many fights. And I think it's important that we work at organizing to involve people in that fight and make sure people see, what's going on. I think one of the things I hear most often critiques of our party and politics in general from young people in my organizing is they don't feel like their electeds or their leaders are actually putting up a fight for them or for their community. And so I think it's important that yes, there's going to be a lot of battles that we have over the next 2 years in Congress, but how are we connect? Like, where's the through line from what's going on in the Capitol to what's going on in Orlando, Florida, or Miami, Florida, or wherever, right, across this country? And I think that's where the inside-outside game is so important. It's important when we have big things like Build Back Better and we're passing bold transformational legislation. It's also important when we're on the defense, because this is like a time, the next 2 years, where we can really build up infrastructure. So when we get to the place where we're trying to get people to go out and vote, we don't have to persuade them to vote. We just have to remind them to go vote. It's part of the problem we have in Florida. And I think that through line is very important.
Our message at NextGen is that we don't put our hope in any single politician or party. We put our hope in America's young people, and that policy doesn't just happen in Congress. It also happens at the state and local level. And there's going to be a lot of work, especially to celebrate and also move forward and make sure people take advantage of with the climate legislation that's come out. And also opportunities in places like Michigan, where there's a trifecta to move progressive policy forward that will be really transformational. So there's a lot we can do at the state and local level. And then you can show over 2 years, this is why showing up and voting matters, because who has control determines what the outcome is. And we need to determine who's in there for us.
Excellent. And maybe one last question here before kind of opening it up, which is, obviously overall a great story in terms of historic turnout or the second highest turnout of young voters in this midterm, but a real pattern over the last few years. But you sort of touched on this, Congressman. We still see young voters, 3/4 of young voters are not showing up, that young voters still vote at a lower rate than sort of older generations. So just a broader reflection on there's, as great as the story has been, I think Circle's Tufts University's data show that young voters used to come out at a rate of about 20%. And in sort of 9 battleground states in this midterm, it was closer to 31%, which is a huge shift that takes a lot of resources and investment. And yet none of us want to be satisfied with 31% turnout rates. And so, there's opportunities to grow here. What does that look like sort of moving forward?
Well, I would say education is extremely important. While college campuses, as we've noted, is a really important place for civic engagement, I think including more education when they're younger, when students are in public education or private school, whatever, wherever they are, is really, really important to make sure that we have an emphasis on civic engagement. I think one thing I just wanted to note that in our post-election survey, we actually had this really incredible number. We asked among voters sort of what have they done since the 2020 election? Have they donated to a political candidate? Have they gone to an event? Have they volunteered for a candidate? Have they just been talking to friends and family about politics? And it was pretty comical, I think, that, you sort of imagine you're like Uncle Joe Schmo, like at Thanksgiving, talking to you about politics, and these really older generations, like 80% say they're talking to their friends and family about politics. It's a little bit younger for Gen Z, but their actual civic engagement of volunteering and attending events is far higher than any other generation. I think it was 46% of Gen Z said that they attended an event or volunteered for a candidate since 2020. The next closest, I think, was 23% among millennials. So that's a really incredible action, and I think something NextGen is probably a big part of. So I think just making sure that we're really engaging our youth at a young age and not just on college campuses is important. One other thing I would say is implementing more pro-voter policies is really important, making sure that we have things like automatic voter registration or mail-in ballot, early voting. These things really take down barriers to voting that, unfortunately really stop some people from being able to get childcare or leave school or do, their civic duty. So I think those are two really important things that we should be doing.
So one, I thank you, CAP, for having this conversation January 2023 about the youth vote. We could be having it later in 2024, but we're having it now. So we have time to organize and think about what we do. I think it's policy and its investment are two things we need. There's a lot we can be doing in states. We talk about barriers. I live in Texas, which makes it one of the hardest states to register in the country. We're also the third youngest state, and we have rules set in place. Like there is no mail-in ballot unless you're over 65. That is age discrimination. And it's also racial discrimination. We've tried to do some lawsuits about racial discrimination as well, because it's younger people tend to be more people of color in our states. So what we have seen are policies that really automatic voter registration in states that's really shifting and making it easier for young people to vote. So pushing for those policies and pre-registration also for people that are under 18, giving them the opportunity to do that. It's a growing movement in states, and there's a lot we need to be pushing for at the state level for that work. Also, while Congress is not doing as much as something we can push for at the state level. And then I really want to thank also people like Congressman Maxwell Frost. I'm super proud. My colleague, Greg Casar, was my baby organizer when he learned how to start organizing at Workers' Defense Project, is now a congressman from Texas. We think a lot about the power of institution, which is if we knock on this many doors, we can turn this many people out. And we need that power, and we need it to get to scale, especially in youth organizing, because we are still, quite frank, the bastard stepchild of investment in organizing to win elections. But there's the power of inspiration, which is the power of storytelling. And people can't follow you if they can't see you. And now we have a cohort of young, dynamic people in leadership in Congress that come from communities, that come from organizing, and millions of people are following. And so that, I think, is just so powerful. It's not something we quantify, but it is really, I think, unleashed people's ability to see what can be done and believe that they can be part of the change as well to make it happen.
No, 100%. And to say something, sorry, y'all, I lost my voice because I had a swearing in concert last week. And so just a heads up, my voice usually isn't like this. I think the policy is such an important part, because I've for the last 10 years, I've been with clipboards registering voters on campuses across my state, right? And really across the country as well. And the times where we've had the best luck in doing that has been when the environment was right for it. And what I mean by that is the best way to register voters right now is obviously a clipboard going to register people, but the best way is actually when their environment is set and people are registering to vote on their own. People are going online on their own because they feel compelled to. And I think a movement, not just because I worked there, but I think a movement that really showed this was March for Our Lives, because it was part electoral organizing, part voting, part culture. If people don't remember, culture was a huge part of March for Our Lives. I remember it was like the cool thing to do, and people were registering to vote. And I think that's part of the reason 2018 was such a good year with youth turnout, was a moment that a lot of organizations, because of their year-round organizing that had been going on for a long time, had the infrastructure to capture that moment and give young people a political home. And it's not always that cut and dry and perfect. I'm not saying that at all. But I think having the year-round organizing is important, because we will have these moments. Some will stem from tragedy, unfortunately. Some will stem from inspiration. But that's why this year-round organizing is so important. We need to be ready to capture people and give them a political home and give them a way to organize and plug in that's maybe outside of the apparatus of the party, which I'm a part of, that I love, and blah, blah, blah. That way they can be a part of it. And have a place where they can do that organizing. And the policy is so important too, because there are institutional barriers that keep young people from voting. The youth vote has always been the lowest piece of the pie per se. Young people now are voting at higher numbers than we've ever seen in past generations at our current age. Half of Gen Z can't even vote yet. But I think things like automatic voter registration, making it easier to vote, we need to explore allowing people to vote at a younger age. It's 16, especially in municipal elections. 18 is a weird age to introduce any habit. Either way, that's a whole other thing. But I think there's a lot of structural things we need to talk about and get to that will make it easier, and not an extracurricular activity to vote, but like part of, institutionalizing it in society.
Fantastic. I'm going to look to my colleague, Diane, to we have both in-person audience and then a lot of folks online and some questions submitted beforehand. I don't know if.
Great. Yeah. If you can state your name and affiliation before asking your question, that would be perfect.
Hi, I'm Kara Zelaya from Daily Kos, and I'm also a UCF alum. So as a home stater from Florida, you were the shining light of the night.
Nights?
I spend a lot of my time organizing around student debt cancellation because I do see that and climate change as not only a racial justice issue, but an existential economic crisis. The messaging around both of those issues definitely needs work. I push against this all the time, how I can in my activism. And I'm wondering what language you're seeing around those two issues specifically that really is resonating with young voters.
Yes, so we did some, sorry. So we've done some research on this at Navigator. I would have to look specifically at the young voters, but we specifically had been looking at the language around Pell Grant recipients and the actual actions that were done by the Biden administration, so that we could get an accurate portrayal of what's been going on. I think some things of reckoning with we've been looking at sort of the racial wealth gap and how we can use that as a bridge. And so I think there's definitely more research to be done, but as we've discussed it specifically with youth voters, that's something that we've seen as sort of like an opening light for, there's been all these barriers. This is a way that we can make up for some of the really backwards policies that have been enacted. But I think more generally, we've specifically from youth voters, there's, I think 7 in 10 support student loan debt cancellation. It's a really popular policy. Majorities, not just young voters, support the legislation. So I think that's also going to be a big fight coming this year with the courts, and something we are definitely watching and hoping to be a resource for.
Edie, do you want to take that over?
And if hopefully everything does move forward in the courts, it's also a great organizing opportunity to talk to young people. I was on college campuses after the announcement happened. We were doing some celebrations, and there was a huge person that didn't understand it, didn't know if they benefited or not. And so it's a huge opportunity to make sure that people understand how they benefit and how their vote translated to that win. If we think about where we were in a conversation 6 or 5 years ago on student debt cancellation, we are not where we are today. And I think that's the other thing that we have to do as organizers when you talk about setting expectations, is to remind people about how organizing takes time, and that the arch of history, yes, it bends towards justice, but we have to be the ones to bend it, and that it takes organizing and investment. And so this is not the end of where we need to be on the conversation, because it's my personal belief that it was a radical idea that college, that we would have tuition-free K through 12, and that was a radical idea once. But what a high school diploma is what a college degree is really today. And so we need to make sure we're investing in our greatest asset, which is the American people and their education.
Next question.
Yeah, we have one from the audience from USA Today. What are your thoughts on digital campaigning in 2024? What's in, what's out, and are there any new trends that we can see, that we can expect to see to pick up over the next 2 years?
Great question. Changing landscape. I'm curious how your own campaign went, Congressman. Yeah.
Well, I think it's important to use both the traditional methods and also creative and new methods going on. I'm really a fan of, again, using every tool in the toolbox and doing everything we can to reach voters where they're at. And the fact of the matter is that different methods of communication work better for certain people. And it might not break down to age the way you think it might. There's a lot of traditional methods of communication when you use them in an untraditional, creative way that actually hit young people pretty hard for us. Now, as far as digital campaigning is concerned, texting was a huge thing for us. It's getting pretty oversaturated now, especially with the fundraising text. Sorry if you got one from me, you probably did. But it was really helpful in our organizing because it was a very direct and easy way to get a message across to folks. And I think that the CTA, the call to action that you have in these methods of communication is really important, especially when you're thinking about young people. If it's like donating or like registered, there's like a difference between more high bar ask and something that's more low bar. And what we found, and not to get too into like, organizer speak, but like when we got people into that kind of ladder of engagement, having a low bar, really cool, exciting ask for our young people on college campuses and outside of them really helped us bring people into the in-person organizing, which I think is where a lot of the transformational work happened. Not to say digital, sorry, I'm not saying digital work is not transformational. It is. I'm not an expert on it, to be honest, but we used a lot of that to bring people in to a lot of our in-person organizing. And we had a lot of digital phone banks and et cetera.
I just wanted to, I think that a big question too is how much do we use social media? How much do we use influencers to reach especially young people? So we've run the last 2 cycles, I believe the largest influencer programs to reach young people in the country. And we're doing a study, which once we have the voter file, we are looking at the vote impact of influencer programs and actually being able to do a data analysis on it, comparing it to the voter file. So we will have that research for everyone, which we think will be really important to know how hard, how fast we go. Though obviously it's an incredible way to reach young people.
I'll just say one other thing. As far as texting goes, we asked in our survey of the 2022 electorate how campaigns, if people had been contacted by campaigns, and if and how, whether it was at their door, whether it was by mail, and 50% of young people said it was by text by the Democratic campaign, a little bit less from the Republican campaign. But that's half of young people saying they're getting texts from campaigns. I'm curious to know about how it's working.
If they liked it.
They did not. Well, we don't know what impact it had, but it's really interesting to see the saturation of texting.
Yeah.
Diane, do you want to go to our next question? I don't know if it's in, is anyone in person? Sorry. Yeah.
Hi, Jennifer Tran from UC Berkeley. So I'm freshly 18 and I'm from a district in California that has one of the lowest youth voter turnouts in the nation. Republican Michelle Steele is my representative. And so while youth organizing, I found that one of the biggest issues I saw was that the young people that were voting in America were relatively on the older side of young, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds. They were significantly less engaged. So my question is, how do you think progressives could engage young voters, especially those that are 18 to 20, and then also those that are not 18 yet, 17, 16-year-olds, to be engaged in politics before they are even eligible to vote or when they're freshly eligible to vote?
So I think a lot of this leads back to also policy. There's been a lot of cutting for civics education in high schools across the country, which we know is a huge problem. In my home state, we actually have a law that says that you have to every high school has to give an opportunity twice a year to do in-person high school voter registration. 60% of high schools do not do it. So there's no enforcement mechanism, but there is a lot of policies. We need to be capturing people, especially in high school. And that also really helps address the folks that don't go, not everybody needs to go to college. Like, it helps address and reach people before, if we're trying to capture everyone in college. NextGen is going to be leading an effort, and we're going to be laying the groundwork for this year to start doing a national high school voter registration program. So if you're interested in that, Harry can raise his hand and you can talk to him. But it's something that we need to be doing. And the best actually people to get into high schools are other young people. So it doesn't require that many young people. 1 or 2 people can actually lead a drive at their own high school. And so there's a lot that young people, even if it's different in your community, you can make a lot of difference just at your one high school. And even if you don't go to that high school anymore, you can go back to that high school and ask them, hey, I went here last year. I'd like to do this as a volunteer, and make sure you all give your students the opportunity to vote as well.
I'll add real quick, and I talked about this before. I think the environment that we build is really, really important. And the culture we build around civics and what's going on is really, really important, and young people being involved, especially in an era where we're getting a lot of our information from Twitter or social media, and we're taking cues from the same social media and taking cues from our friends in our school environments, et cetera. So I think a big thing, not just electeds, but just leaders, organizations in general, is figuring out how do we bridge the gap between cool and consciousness. And that's something I'm always kind of thinking about. And I think we have some great opportunity over this next 2 years to do that. Because I'm a musician, I come from the arts world, I'm thinking about how do we integrate our artists with a lot of this. And I think it's a good through line to a lot of young folks that helps create an environment. It's not necessarily a peer-to-peer interaction, but I think it creates the world where when you have that interaction, you're more likely to be converted from, not being registered to vote to being registered to vote. And then the next really important one that doesn't get talked about a lot, being registered to vote and not voting to being registered to vote and voting. Because the fact of the matter is a lot of young people are registered to vote. We see this all across Florida, but then they don't go out and vote. And so kind of thinking holistically about that.
Excellent. Diana.
Yeah, we have one more from the online audience, and then we can take another from in person.
Great.
What are the plans to keep young people involved in the off-cycle election years?
Oh, it's a great question. Mayor's races, obviously a handful of governor's races. Some states have their state legislatures. I'm curious how you all see that as organizing opportunities.
So one of the other studies we did, which we'll have out, is we in Pennsylvania, where we've been for many years, we have done, and we'll have that once we have the voter file back out, but we have it for the primaries, looking at how does consistent off-cycle engagement impact turnout in a general election. So we've spent a lot of time in off cycles talking to young people, for example, when even basic things like, hey, you can get your vaccine and here's how you can get it for free. We're hopeful that student debt relief will move forward so that we can talk to young people about making sure that they know how the benefits work. There's going to be opportunities around climate legislation around, did you know that there's if you want an electric car, here's how it works, solar panels, all of these other things, rebate programs that will be available to young people. And we see our job as not just making sure that young people go out and vote, but they know how their vote made a difference in their lives. And then working at the local level as well. These municipal races, where especially there's a lot of other young candidates running, is an exciting way to get young people engaged. And so it's something that we make sure we stay in contact with all of our voters, not just 8 weeks leading up to an election, but that they're hearing from us throughout in between elections.
Yeah, I found that some of the most transformational, like local candidates and just candidates in general, the ones that do year-round organizing. We're going to keep, organizing year-round. We have a state representative in my district, Anna Scamani, who's the state representative, who does an amazing job of that as well. And I think it's important to have that year-round organizing, keep your infrastructure going, because then as we get into these off-year elections, it's easier to activate people, to get them involved in really these positions that have a greater influence on people's day-to-day life. And I think it's really important that we're honest about it and we talk about it, and that we recruit really good, exciting, progressive candidates for these like local seats.
Excellent. A few more questions. Oh, did you want to answer that? Yeah.
I have one addition.
Yeah, please.
I think one other thing that we haven't talked too much about is really holding your representatives accountable, whether that's locally or federally. You have to put a microphone to your representative if they're not doing something that you think aligns with the values of your constituents. We should be blaring that. We should be amplifying it and making sure that other constituents know, and you're going to follow up, not just by voting, but by blaring that out to other constituents. So that's one other way.
Fantastic. I think there's a question here in the room.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Larissa, and I run the Young Adult Program at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. And I really love what you were saying, Representative Frost, about bringing young adults, young people to the table. You said that kind of at the beginning of our conversation. And so I want to talk a bit about what happens after the voting, after we've gotten our people elected. Something we teach young adults is that representatives and senators have to listen to you. There is a way to get meetings with them and get your story heard. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. People don't want to take those meetings, or they take them and they're not really listening to what we're saying. So my question is, how do you think that other colleagues of yours could bring more young adults to the table once they're in office? And how do you plan to do that now that you are not elect anymore, but representative? Congratulations.
Thank you. No, this is a great question, because one young person and there's a lot of young people in Congress, to be exact, right? Like this incoming freshman class is really exciting. There's a lot of firsts. There's a lot of very young people of color, progressive folks who've come in, Greg Casar being one, Delia Ramirez, Summer Lee, Robert Garcia. I could go on for a long time. But so it's really exciting. I'm definitely not the only one. But what I'd say is, like, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 young people going in Congress doesn't mean that the values or best interests of young people will be seen throughout the entire Congress. And I think it's important to know that, right? We see the same thing when we get Black folks in position of power. We see the same thing when we get just people, marginalized communities in position of power. Sometimes we don't see it translate quickly. And a lot of it's because these systems have been around for such a long time. It's almost unfair of us to expect. I remember 4 women of color who came into Congress 2 terms ago, and people were disappointed. Everything didn't change right away. And I'm like, that's kind of an unfair way to judge, for folks who've come in a system that has been here for a long time. Okay, so either way, what I'm getting to is this. I think it's really important that people identify like their gaps and what they want to do before they start, legislating. So that way they can build systems of accountability into their office. For us, we've been working closely with like Florida and Orlando movements, so we can build on this term of like co-governance and like what does it mean to co-govern with the movement in Orlando. So it's young people, but it's also beyond young people. It's like workers, it's immigrants, it's like everybody, right? And I think it's important that people have that conversation. I don't have an answer that makes sense for everyone because I think everything's going to look different in different districts, right? And there's different constituencies and politics and everything like that. But I think having the conversation first and foremost is like the first step. Then the next step is actually acting upon it. And so we're kind of we're in between those steps. We're still figuring out what are those systems of accountability going to look like? What does it look like to co-govern with movements and with unions in Central Florida? What does it look like to do that in a state legislature where we're not going to have any wins there? I mean, Republicans are in a super majority. We have a fascist governor. There's a lot going on in Florida. So, I think it's, we have these, and that's why I say it's really local, like it has to be local specific, because for a lot of other folks, it might be how are we engaging at the state level as well. And for us, that's a conversation, but it's also how we engage on the local level. What does mutual aid look like? How does our office knock doors to help support that work? How are we supporting the work that's going on in our city and municipal and countywide government? And I think that conversation is so important in involving young people, but also just like movements in general in these offices that we hold. Members of Congress, our budget, which is called an MRA, we have, kind of the complete discretion on the way that we spend it in representing our constituents. And there's really creative ways that you can use your budget and that you can use your office to not just bring people to your table, but you go to like your community's table. And so I think the first step is really those conversations, and a lot of members and outside of Congress, a lot of politicians are hesitant to have that, because when you create a system of accountability, you're going to be held accountable, and it can be uncomfortable.
Fantastic. I think we have one more question.
One more virtual question. Even though young Americans want to form a union, what can older union members do better to build the next generation of organizers? What do you see on the ground that's working and what's not?
So I have so many stories I could tell. So I started organizing construction workers when I was in my early 20s, and I worked with the building trades, and I was organizing mostly undocumented workers. To say they were hostile is an understatement. But eventually we all became friends, and it just took time. And I think the approach was one more, which is understandable, of us having to prove ourselves, to prove that we were dedicated enough to the labor movement because of what the labor movement took to create. But I think we would have gone further faster had the approach been of mentorship and welcoming us into the movement versus trying to test if we were committed enough. Those guys are all still my best friends now, but it took a long time to get there. It took about 5 years of what I would say is like a nice hazing period. The approach needs to maybe change with the times is all I would say.
We're making progress slowly. I have a few comments to close, but I don't know if any other last thoughts for the panel before we wrap up. Okay. Oh, yes. No, I saw you pulled it.
Thank you.
Perfect. First of all, I just want to thank everyone for joining. I think this has been a great conversation. Cristina, I agree with your point. I'm glad we're having this now. I think as folks have seen from the last few elections, young voters have been a huge force in really being a bulwark against MAGA Republicans and kind of holding the line. They've also been a force in pushing forward the sort of progressive policies we've seen passed, whether it's the largest investment in climate, canceling student debt, finally doing something, not enough, but something about gun violence. And I do think this is a little bit to your point, Congressman, which I think is an important one maybe to wrap up on, which is, we are going to see dysfunction in Washington for the next 2 years, but we are going to see a different part of government doing something very important, which is actually executing on these and implementing these investments in communities, reshaping communities, whether it's finally starting to make clean energy, more clean energy with good paying jobs, finally actually helping people actually get a better living wage through ending non-compete clauses, canceling student debt, hopefully. But a lot of the work of government, despite the House of Representatives being dysfunction, I'm sorry, you're gonna have to suffer through that, is going to be a really important story that we sort of collectively tell. Because I do think if people feel like government has stopped working, isn't listening, that we are going to see real challenges and continued engagement. And all of you sort of made that point that not only do we have to keep them engaged, but we've got to keep reminding young people about how they have brought us to this point and how they can shape things going forward. So I thank you all for your comments. I thank the audience for joining us. Just the start of a really important ongoing conversation. Thanks all.
Thank you.